He was the county sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law. But when his wife discovered his empire of lies, he made a choice that would expose him as the ultimate predator hiding behind a badge. The breaking point came in open court during a victim impact statement, when he did something so monstrous that even the judge abandoned all restraint. But it was his own partner, the one person he thought would protect his secrets, who delivered the final devastating blow. This is the story of Sheriff Raymond Carter, a man who believed his power made him untouchable, and the relentless pursuit of justice that would prove him catastrophically wrong. The crime scene was located in a sprawling ranch-style home in the affluent suburbs of Memphis, Tennessee, a property befitting the status of its owner, Sheriff Raymond Carter. This city, known for its rich musical heritage and Southern hospitality, was about to confront a horror that would shake it to its core. Beneath the veneer of culture and tradition, the same ancient evils of greed and betrayal thrived with a particular viciousness. Tonight, in a home that was supposed to be a sanctuary, that evil would manifest in a hail of gunfire and the spilling of innocent blood. Jasmine Carter had spent the last 6 months of her life unraveling a nightmare, one that had been woven by the man she loved. She had discovered a vast and complex web of financial fraud, a scheme orchestrated by her husband, Raymond, to embezzle millions from the county and from private investors who trusted him implicitly. Jasmine, a meticulous accountant by trade, had found the hidden ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the proof of a life built on a foundation of pure corruption. She had confronted Raymond, giving him an ultimatum: turn himself in, or she would go to the district attorney with everything she had found. That confrontation had sealed her fate, setting in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. Raymond Carter, a man who saw the law not as a set of rules to follow, but as a tool to be manipulated, made a cold and calculated decision. He could not allow his empire to crumble, his reputation to be destroyed, or his freedom to be taken away. On a warm Tennessee evening, as the sun set over the Mississippi River, he walked into his home office where Jasmine was organizing the final pieces of evidence and ended her life without a moment of hesitation. The initial 911 call was a masterful performance of grief and confusion, a testament to Raymond's years of practice in deception. He told the dispatcher that he had just returned home from a late-night meeting to find his wife dead, the victim of what appeared to be a home invasion gone horribly wrong. His voice was thick with feigned sorrow, his words carefully chosen to paint a picture of a heartbroken husband stumbling upon an unimaginable horror. He established his alibi, mentioned a fictitious suspicious vehicle he had seen, and played the part of the grieving victim perfectly. Detective Marcus Thompson of the Memphis Police Department was assigned the case, a decision that immediately created tension with the sheriff's office. Thompson was an old-school cop, a man with a deep-seated distrust of those who wielded power too comfortably, and he could sense that something was profoundly wrong from the moment he stepped onto the property. The scene felt staged, too clean in some areas and too chaotic in others, and the sheriff's demeanor struck him as performative rather than genuinely devastated. While Raymond's deputies were quick to accept his version of events, Thompson saw not a grieving husband, but a confident predator who believed he had just committed the perfect crime. Jasmine Carter was more than just a victim. She was a woman of incredible integrity and quiet strength. Friends and family would later describe her as the moral compass of the Carter family, a gentle but firm presence who had grown increasingly concerned about her husband's arrogance and his obsession with wealth and status. Her decision to expose him was not an act of revenge, but an act of profound civic duty, a final desperate attempt to stop the man she loved from causing any more harm. Raymond's partner, Deputy Terrell Washington, was one of the first to arrive at the scene. He had worked alongside Raymond for 15 years, viewing him as a mentor and a friend, and he was initially blinded by his loyalty. He helped secure the scene, comforted his boss, and relayed the sheriff's account to the other officers, never once questioning the narrative that was being presented to him. Yet even in those early hours, a small seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind, planted by the cold, almost analytical way Raymond described the discovery of his wife's body. The arrest of Sheriff Raymond Carter did not happen quickly. It was the culmination of 3 weeks of painstaking, covert investigation led by Detective Marcus Thompson. Thompson and his team had to operate with extreme discretion, knowing that their target controlled a significant portion of the law enforcement resources in the county. They worked out of a borrowed office, kept paper files instead of digital ones, and communicated through burner phones, constantly aware that Raymond's allies were everywhere. The turning point came with the analysis of the Carter home smart speaker, a device Raymond had overlooked in his cleanup. Forensics experts managed to recover fragmented audio files from the device's rolling buffer, capturing the final terrifying moments of Jasmine Carter's life. The recording contained the sounds of her pleading with her husband, her voice filled with desperate resolve as she told him she could not let him continue his crimes. Then there was Raymond's voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, followed by the muffled sounds that audio experts would identify as gunshots. Armed with this undeniable evidence, Detective Thompson knew he had to act. The arrest was planned like a tactical operation, executed at dawn by a team of state troopers, bypassing the local sheriff's department entirely. They found Raymond Carter in his kitchen, calmly drinking a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper, which featured a story praising his tireless efforts to find his wife's killer. His reaction to the heavily armed troopers bursting into his home was not one of surprise or fear, but of profound, indignant anger. He saw the arrest not as a consequence of his actions, but as a personal betrayal by a system he believed he owned. In the interrogation room, Raymond Carter was the epitome of arrogance, a man utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He sat across from Detective Thompson, a small condescending smile playing on his lips, and treated the entire proceeding as a tiresome formality. He denied everything with incredible confidence, leaning back in his chair and daring the police to prove their theories. He portrayed himself as the victim of a political witch hunt, a grieving husband being persecuted by jealous rivals who wanted to tarnish his good name. Thompson began by laying out the preliminary evidence, the inconsistencies in his timeline, the shoe print that matched his own boots, the financial records that proved his motive. With each piece of evidence, Raymond had a ready-made excuse, a plausible-sounding lie delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had been lying his entire life. When Thompson finally played the audio from the smart speaker, the air in the room changed. For the first time, a crack appeared in Raymond's facade, a brief flicker of genuine shock in his eyes as he heard his own cold voice and the sounds of the murder. But the shock was quickly replaced by a renewed wave of indignant rage. He slammed his fist on the table, his face turning a deep shade of red, and accused the detectives of fabricating the evidence, of using deepfake technology to frame him. His denials became more elaborate and more unhinged as the interrogation wore on. He claimed the voice on the recording was not his, but that of a professional impersonator hired by his political enemies. He insisted that the sounds of the gunshots were actually the sounds of a car backfiring, conveniently captured by the device. Each lie was more audacious than the last, a clear demonstration of his pathological inability to accept responsibility and his profound belief that he could talk his way out of anything. Throughout the long hours of questioning, Raymond never once shed a tear for his wife. He spoke of her only in the context of her betrayal, framing her discovery of his crimes as an act of disloyalty rather than an act of courage. In his twisted worldview, she was the one who had wronged him. She was the one who had threatened to destroy the life he had built, and therefore her death was a consequence of her own actions. With Raymond Carter in custody, the full scale of his depravity began to come into focus. The investigation, now freed from the constraints of operating in the shadows, expanded rapidly, and what it uncovered was a portrait of a man who was not just a killer and a thief, but a monster of profound and varied appetites. Detective Thompson and his team executed a series of search warrants on properties owned by Carter, including a secluded hunting cabin deep in the Tennessee wilderness. It was here that they found the first tangible evidence of his secret world. The cabin was not a rustic retreat. It was a meticulously organized playground for his darkest impulses. Inside, investigators discovered a hidden, climate-controlled room. This room was Raymond's true office, the nerve center of his criminal enterprises, and the museum of his secret life. On one side were computers and encrypted hard drives containing the details of his financial schemes, a digital record of years of embezzlement, money laundering, and extortion. But it was the other side of a room that left even the most hardened detectives speechless. It was a collection of trophies, personal items taken from dozens of individuals who had been victimized by Raymond over the years. There were driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, and photographs, each item meticulously labeled with a date and a cryptic note. Investigators soon realized they were looking at evidence of a long and prolific career as a predator. The financial crimes were just one aspect of his double life. He had also used his position of authority to assault, intimidate, and terrorize countless people. The investigation into the financial crimes revealed a scheme of breathtaking audacity. Raymond had created a network of shell corporations, using his knowledge of legal loopholes to funnel millions of dollars of public funds into his own pockets. He had rigged county contracts, extorted local business owners, and manipulated evidence in civil cases, all for his own personal enrichment. His wife, Jasmine, had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. As detectives dug deeper, they began to connect the trophies in the cabin to unsolved crimes and cold cases from across the state. A locket matched the description of one taken during an unsolved assault from 5 years prior. A set of car keys belonged to a young woman who had disappeared after a traffic stop, her case long since gone cold. It became terrifyingly clear that Jasmine's murder was not an isolated act of violence, but the desperate act of a man trying to prevent his entire secret world from being exposed. The trial of the state of Tennessee versus Raymond Carter began with intense media scrutiny. The courtroom was packed to capacity with journalists, members of the public, and the two families at the center of the tragedy, seated on opposite sides of the aisle like warring factions. Raymond Carter, dressed in a tailored suit that had been carefully selected to project an image of respectability, sat at the defense table with a look of calm, almost bored indifference. He was no longer the sheriff, but he still carried himself with the unshakable arrogance of a man who believed he was in control. Prosecutor Nicole Harper began with a powerful opening statement. She revealed to the jury for the first time the full extent of Raymond Carter's double life. She told them that this was not just a case about the tragic death of a wife at the hands of her husband. It was a case about a serial predator who had used his badge to terrorize the community for years. The defense immediately objected, accusing Harper of prosecutorial misconduct and attempting to prejudice the jury with irrelevant information. But the judge, having already seen the mountain of evidence against Carter in pretrial hearings, overruled the objection. The confident smirk on Raymond Carter's face faltered for the first time, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated rage. The first witness for the prosecution was Jasmine Carter's mother, a dignified woman who spoke with quiet, heartbreaking clarity. She described her daughter's growing fear of her husband, her discovery of the financial crimes, and her final fateful decision to go to the authorities. Through her tears, she read aloud the last text message she had received from her daughter, a message that simply said, "I have to do the right thing, Mom. I love you." As she spoke, Raymond Carter watched her with a cold, unnerving detachment, as if he were observing a character in a play rather than the grieving mother of the woman he had killed. The prosecution then began to methodically lay out the forensic evidence. They presented the shoe print from the crime scene, a perfect match to the custom-made boots he was wearing on the night of the murder. They presented the ballistics report, which proved that the bullets that killed Jasmine had been fired from his off-duty service weapon. And most damningly, they played the audio recording from the smart speaker. The entire courtroom fell silent as the audio began to play. The mundane sounds of a quiet evening suddenly giving way to the sounds of a desperate argument, followed by the muffled pops that everyone in the room knew were the sounds of a life being extinguished. Jasmine's mother let out a strangled sob and had to be escorted from the courtroom. The jury was visibly shaken, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. As the trial entered its second week, the prosecution introduced a piece of evidence that would implicate another individual in Raymond's circle of trust. They presented a series of text messages exchanged between Raymond Carter and his partner, Deputy Terrell Washington, in the weeks leading up to the murder. The messages were a chilling chronicle of Raymond's escalating rage and his cold, calculated planning. He had not just confided in Washington. He had used him as a sounding board for his murderous intentions. The most damning message was sent just 2 days before the murder. Raymond wrote, "The problem is going to be taken care of this weekend. She's not going to ruin everything I've built." Washington's reply was a single chilling word: understood. When this exchange was displayed on the large screens in the courtroom, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. It was the digital blueprint of a murder plot. Faced with the undeniable proof of his own complicity and offered a plea deal in exchange for his testimony, Terrell Washington had agreed to testify against his former boss. His appearance in the courtroom was a moment of high drama. Washington's testimony was quiet, halting, and utterly compelling. He described his 15-year relationship with Raymond, his initial admiration giving way to a creeping sense of fear and unease. He told the jury about the sheriff's volatile temper, his obsession with money, and his belief that he was above the law. When Prosecutor Harper asked him about the text messages, Washington's voice broke. He admitted that he knew what Raymond was planning, that he had had a chance to stop it, and that he had been too afraid to do so. During Washington's testimony, Raymond Carter stared at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. He began to mutter under his breath, his words inaudible to the rest of the courtroom, but clearly visible to the jury. He was trying to intimidate the witness, to assert his dominance even from the defendant's chair. The judge had to issue a stern warning. The defense's primary alibi for Raymond rested on the testimony of a man named Vincent Brooks, a wealthy real estate developer and a longtime friend and business associate of the Carter family. Brooks was prepared to testify that he had been in a late-night meeting with Raymond at the time of the murder. When Brooks took the stand, he delivered his story with smooth and practiced ease. He was the perfect witness for the defense, articulate, credible, and unshakable. Then it was Nicole Harper's turn for cross-examination. She approached the witness with calm, almost serene confidence. She asked Brooks about his long-standing business relationship with the Carter family, establishing the deep financial ties and the decades of personal loyalty between them. The trap was sprung with a single devastating question. Harper asked, "Mr. Brooks, were you aware that your personal assistant is currently in federal custody and has agreed to testify about your role in a wide-ranging bid rigging scheme, a scheme orchestrated by you and your friend Raymond Carter?" The courtroom erupted. Brooks's composure shattered in an instant. The color drained from his face, and his confident smirk was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Harper then produced a series of documents, copies of emails between Brooks and his assistant that laid out the details of the bid rigging scheme in black and white. She had not just caught him in a lie. She had exposed him as a fellow criminal, a man with a powerful motive to lie for his co-conspirator. She then presented evidence that proved he was not even in his office on the night of the murder. She showed security footage from his own building's garage, footage that showed his car leaving hours before the supposed meeting with Raymond ever took place. As the full weight of his predicament crashed down on him, Vincent Brooks crumbled. He began to sob on the witness stand. In a final desperate attempt to save himself, he confessed everything. He admitted that the alibi was a complete fabrication, a story that he and Raymond had concocted together. He then went even further, admitting that Raymond had threatened him, telling him that if he did not provide the alibi, Raymond would expose his role in the bid-rigging scheme and ensure that he spent the rest of his life in prison. Raymond Carter's reaction to this implosion was not one of despair, but of pure, unrestrained fury. He stood up at the defense table and began to scream at Brooks, calling him a traitor and a weak, pathetic coward. His carefully constructed mask of the calm, dignified victim had been ripped away, revealing the raging, violent monster that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. It took 3 bailiffs to restrain him and drag him from the courtroom, his screams echoing down the hallway. The prosecution's next witness was Terrell Washington, recalled to the stand with one final devastating revelation. Washington testified that on the day of the murder, Raymond had called him into his office for a private meeting. It was here that Raymond had laid out his plan in chilling, meticulous detail. He had not just decided to kill his wife. He had planned the crime like a military operation, complete with a timeline, a manufactured crime scene, and a carefully crafted alibi. The most sadistic part of the plan was what Raymond intended to do after the murder. He had instructed Washington to be the one to discover a key piece of fabricated evidence, a forged suicide note supposedly written by Jasmine. The note was designed to portray her as mentally unstable and to suggest that she had taken her own life after framing Raymond for her financial crimes. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty, a plan to not only murder his wife, but to posthumously destroy her reputation and frame her for his own sins. But the plan had gone wrong. Raymond, in his arrogance, had committed the murder before the faked evidence was in place. When Washington arrived at the scene, he had expected to find a suicide, but instead he found a homicide. It was in that moment, Washington testified, that he knew he could not go through with the plan. He had been a coward, he admitted, but he was not a monster. Then came the final devastating revelation. Nicole Harper presented the court with an audio recording, a recording of a phone call that Washington had secretly made to his brother, a lawyer, just hours after the murder. On the recording, a frantic and terrified Washington could be heard describing Raymond's confession and the diabolical plan to frame his dead wife. He killed her. He told me he was going to kill her, and now he wants me to plant a fake suicide note. Washington sobbed on the recording. He's a monster, and he's going to kill me if I don't help him. The recording was the ultimate corroboration of Washington's testimony, an undeniable piece of evidence that had been captured in the raw, immediate aftermath of the crime. The revelation that Raymond had planned to frame his wife for his own crimes, to poison her memory even in death, was the final definitive proof of his absolute depravity. It showed a man with no bottom, no moral line he would not cross. With the closing arguments concluded, the trial moved into its final emotional phase, the victim impact statements. Jasmine's father was the first to speak. He was a retired teacher, a quiet and gentle man who was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He walked to the podium with a single small photograph of his daughter taken on her last birthday. He spoke of her kindness, her intelligence, and her unwavering sense of right and wrong. He did not speak with anger, but with a deep and bottomless sorrow. He described the immense void that Jasmine's death had left in their family, the empty chair at the dinner table, the grandchildren who would now grow up without their mother's love. Throughout this gut-wrenching testimony, Raymond Carter sat at the defense table with a look of profound and insulting boredom. He cleaned his fingernails. He stifled a theatrical yawn, and he repeatedly glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall, as if he were waiting for a tedious meeting to end. Then, as Jasmine's father reached the most emotional part of his statement, his voice cracking as he described his last conversation with his daughter, Raymond did something so shocking, so utterly devoid of human decency that it stunned the entire courtroom into a momentary, horrified silence. He began to clap. It was not a loud or boisterous applause, but a slow, deliberate, and deeply sarcastic clap. Each impact of his hands was a gunshot in the silent room. A twisted, knowing smirk spread across his face as he looked directly at the grieving father, a look of pure, unadulterated sadism. The courtroom exploded. Jasmine's brother let out a roar of pure fury and tried to surge toward the defense table, held back only by the desperate efforts of his family and the court bailiffs. The judge began to hammer his gavel, his voice booming as he demanded order, his face a mask of incandescent rage. Raymond Carter, the architect of this chaos, simply sat back in his chair, the sarcastic smirk still plastered on his face, and watched the pandemonium he had created. He was enjoying it. The judge, his face crimson with fury, ordered the bailiffs to remove Raymond from the courtroom. As he was being dragged away, still smirking, he looked back at Jasmine's family and mouthed a single silent word. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift. After just 2 hours, they returned to the courtroom, their faces grim and resolute. The court clerk read the single fateful word, guilty. As the trial moved to the sentencing phase, the judge looked down from a bench, his eyes locking onto Raymond Carter with an intensity that seemed to burn. When he spoke, his voice was not the measured, dispassionate tone of a judge, but the raw, thunderous roar of a man who had been forced to bear witness to the absolute worst of human nature. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his voice dripping with contempt. "For weeks, this court has been forced to endure your staggering arrogance, your pathological lies, and your profound, almost inhuman disrespect for the sanctity of human life and the rule of law. You are a cancer on the body of this community, a man who took an oath to protect and serve and used that sacred trust as a shield to hide a lifetime of depravity." The judge continued, his voice rising with each word. "You did not just kill your wife, Mr. Carter. You tried to kill her memory. You tried to poison her legacy with your pathetic, cowardly lies. That, even more than the murder itself, is the true measure of the blackness of your soul." Throughout this verbal evisceration, Raymond Carter stood impassive, a faint, defiant smirk still playing on his lips. But as the judge's words continued to rain down upon him, the smirk began to fade, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. "It is a sentence of this court," the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "that you, Raymond Carter, shall be confined to the Tennessee Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life. There will be no possibility of parole. You will leave this courtroom today, and you will spend every last second of the rest of your miserable existence in a cage, like the animal you are." The finality of the sentence and the raw personal fury with which it was delivered finally broke through Raymond Carter's wall of arrogance. As the bailiffs moved to cuff him, his face contorted into a mask of pathetic, self-pitying rage. The man who had laughed at the prosecutor, who had clapped at a father's grief, who had believed himself to be untouchable, was now just another convicted killer, his life reduced to the four cold walls of a prison cell. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, the Carter family erupted in a furious outburst. His father screamed threats at the judge. His mother hurled insults at the jury, their display of impotent rage a pathetic final act. On the other side of the aisle, there was only quiet, solemn dignity. Jasmine Carter's family did not celebrate. They simply held each other, their tears a mixture of sorrow for their loss and relief that the long, agonizing ordeal was finally over. Justice had been served not just for Jasmine, but for every person who had been victimized by the man who was now being led away in chains. The city of Memphis could finally begin to heal, its spirit now tempered by the hard-won knowledge that even the most powerful among us must answer for their crimes.